Welcome, everybody. This is our privilege to welcome Francois Grosjean at the 20th Summer School of Psycholinguistics. Francois Grosjean is the source and reference for all researchers interested in the psycholinguistics of bilingualism. Being a psychologist and a bilingual person himself, he introduced a new approach towards the study of bilinguals, the holistic approach. He wants us to investigate the bilingual person as a whole, as a unique person who is a special speaker, hearer, because he or she has a special linguistic competence that is a configuration of two languages. These languages work on the complementarity principle to satisfy the bilingual's needs in communication in different domains of life, with different people, with different purposes, and in different topics. He wants us not to compare bilinguals with monolinguals and brings a very good analog with a high hurdler. Professor Grosjean put special emphasis on methodological questions. When he came to our summer school in 1998, he devoted a whole day to enlighten us about the threats of being misled by not being careful enough when choosing our participants, our material, the circumstances, etc., in our research. As a psycholinguist, he has constructed many models for us to understand how bilingual processing is going on, how the language mode influences the linguistic behavior of bilinguals. Francois Grosjean is a caring, tender person. Not only can we read code-switching examples taken from his family conversations, but he dedicates his books to his family members. I have my personal experiences of how empathetic he is. The same can be told about his approach and attitude towards research. He has a blog in Psychology Today where he discusses the hottest questions people are interested in connection with the bilingual person. On a personal note, I met him first at the very first international conference I attended in Leeuwarden back in 1994, where I also met Margaret Dukar, to whom I am also grateful for having accepted our invitation for the Jubilee year of the Summer School of Psycholinguistics. Grosjean's talk at that conference was a trigger for me to become a bilingualism researcher. I had a great opportunity in 1995 when I visited his laboratory in Neuchâtel. He gave me an enormous amount of literature to read, introduced me to the research carried out at that time in the laboratory. I will always be grateful to him for updating me on his latest releases, the wonderful books that are written in such an elegant style, with so much ease, as if it were absolutely trivial something that he discusses. His books are the Bible for every bilingualism researcher. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the chance to listen to Francois Grosjean online. After his talk on the psycholinguistics of bilingualism, we will have a discussion session for about an hour when we may ask Francois, or you may ask Francois your own questions. Francois, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, and thank you first of all to all the technicians and engineers who made this possible, the one in Neuchâtel and the ones in Veszprém. I'm very pleased that we have a link, that you can hear me, that you can see me, and I can see you, so it's wonderful. Hello, Veszprém. I remember very well when I came 20 years ago. It's a wonderful place, and I looked at the weather that you have today, and I said, oh my God, 30 degrees, you're expecting 30 degrees. I hope the room they're in this morning is air-conditioned, and I believe it's cooler than outside, so good luck to you. It's not quite as warm here in Neuchâtel. Happy 20th anniversary to the summer school. You must be very proud, all of you who have worked so hard to make this happen. In particular, Judith, it's wonderful, and I'm really happy for you. I was going to use a PowerPoint presentation to help you follow me in my talk, but unfortunately this cannot take place. So I'll try and use various discourse strategies to make sure I don't lose you as I'm giving my talk. I thought I'd start with a short presentation, about an hour, talk on the work I've been doing on the psycholinguistics of bilingualism in these last years. It's true that I've sort of disappeared from sight due to health problems, but it hasn't stopped me from thinking and reading and writing about bilingualism. I'll then answer questions, written questions that many of you have asked me through Judith Navracic, and I have prepared answers for those. And then if we have time, we should have time, we can just open up the discussion. So, for the talk first. I've been doing a lot of thinking about various topics that have always interested me, and of course that I have some expertise in. I've read and reread many papers by colleagues. I do a lot of reading. I've thought about their findings. I've integrated results across papers. And of course, I've sometimes questioned the conclusions that authors have. And I've elaborated further concepts that have been close to my heart and that I've proposed over the years. And this work has come out in various book chapters and articles. And I thought today we could take 4 topics that I've looked at these last years. And they are: 1, spoken word recognition in bilinguals, not written, spoken word recognition. 2, processing bilingual speech. 3, the complementarity principle. And 4, bicultural bilinguals. The first 2 topics are based on chapters I've written for the new book that Christa Byers-Einlein and myself are putting out this summer in August. It's a Wiley book, and it's called The Listening Bilingual. And I was hoping to show you the cover of this book, because it's a wonderful cover. It's probably, of all the covers of my books, it's probably the most fantastic. It's like a Hawaiian volcano, as it were. And so do, after the talk, go to Wiley's site, look up Grosjean, and look at the cover, because I can't show it to you, I'm afraid. And there are 2 chapters, and the first 2 topics are from those chapters. Now, just a bit about the book. It's a Wiley book. It's dedicated to spoken language processing. I've always been a speech person. I was going to say n'est-ce pas, which is interesting because I'm in a French environment. Spoken language processing, it covers both adults and children, which is rare that books cover both unless they're large encyclopedias. And it brings together various strands of speech processing that are usually studied independently: speech perception, spoken word recognition, higher level processing, mixed language processing, etc. And in addition, for those of you who are in a more applied field, such as speech language pathology, it has 2 chapters on assessment of speech perception and comprehension, one on adults and one on children. So hopefully this book will be a useful contribution to the field of bilingualism. Now, let me come to my first topic, and I'll try and remind you what each topic is. I can actually follow my talk on the computer here, and I'm sorry you can't. The first topic is spoken word recognition in bilinguals. And the very first question I asked myself was, how do bilinguals fare when doing spoken word recognition? Okay, how do they fare? How do they? And if you look at the literature over the last 20, 30 years, which I've done, the picture is split. You have a gloomy picture on one side, coming from psycholinguists in the Netherlands, in Spain, and they often say they're looking at and studying second language learners, or users, but if you look at their material and description, their participant description, these people are in fact bilingual. And our colleagues in the Netherlands, or some of them at least, okay, Weber and Kotler, Brosma, Kotler again, come out with such things as expressions such as, it's such hard work to do word recognition, or these second language listeners who are in fact bilingual are less efficient when segmenting speech into individual words. And Anne Kotler stresses this also and states that it's true at the very high levels of proficiency. I mean, these are damning statements, as it were, concerning bilinguals. But the other side of the picture is that, in fact, bilinguals recognize words quite efficiently. So, let me remind you that, well, you might not know, but with Carlos Soares in the 80s, I came out of a study where we showed that, in fact, our bilinguals did just as well as monolinguals. Mu Fangxi, who has a chapter in our book, reports that simultaneous bilinguals do as well as monolinguals when listening to words in the quiet. And even Blumenfeld and Marion in 2011 found their bilinguals to be as efficient as monolinguals when identifying target words. So, like many things in research, let's try and find out what's going on. And part of the problem, I think, is that many researchers, one, concentrate on a bilingual second or third language, rarely examine all the bilinguals languages. With Carlos Soares, we did that, Portuguese and English. And, as you know, always compare them to monolinguals. Now, I'm not opposed to sometimes comparing bilinguals to monolinguals, and you'll see that I'll do so at one point during the talk, but one's got to be very careful, okay, for all the reasons that you know. So I looked at these many papers on spoken word recognition, and I saw that these various researchers took into account language exposure, measured as age of arrival in a country, length of residence, age of acquisition. They looked at language use, they looked at language proficiency, and when one steps back from all that, I'm sorry, the conclusion isn't that surprising. Well, word recognition in bilinguals will suffer if a person does not know a language well, does not use the language very often, and has not had a lot of exposure to the language over the years. However, if bilinguals are quite fluent in their languages, have used them extensively over the years, the words tested belong to their habitual domains of use, which is crucial in each language, then there's every chance that word recognition will be very effective. Although, and this is true, it might suffer in noise. I think that's the true message. And let's keep in mind, and many papers do not sort of step back a bit and say, let's keep in mind what I'm going to say, that in fact, any difficulties at some point doing word recognition can be made up in everyday communication by the fact that it takes place in context, linguistic and extra-linguistic, and of course that language is highly redundant. Okay, so that was the first question I asked myself. How do they do in word recognition? I'm just going to follow it here. The second question that I asked myself is, what's the importance of speech perception and processing mechanisms during word recognition? Of course, speech perception has to take place as word recognition starts, and there are, of course, many processing mechanisms involved. Okay, so I first looked at speech perception, and that's where the Dutch literature and Spanish, Catalan literature is useful. And I noticed that there were many studies of contrasts, of phonetic contrasts, where the first language has one sound category and the second language has two, okay? And those two are assimilated to just one category in some of these subjects. I know there are some Dutch speakers in the audience, so I won't try, but it's the Dutch and the English and or the Spanish versus the Catalan A and E. Thank God French has the same contrast. So in this research, we see that there's an increase in the number of candidates prior to word recognition, and hence there's a slight delay. We see that there's occasional activation of phantom words, that is, words that are not actually present in the speech signal, and we see that there are errors in recognition. Again, let's step back a bit. These friends, colleagues, have taken particularly difficult contrasts, haven't they? Most are just fine. And secondly, for the same reasons I've just given a few minutes ago, when continuous speech is being processed, we have all this help from the syntactic, semantic, pragmatic processing, and we usually manage. Once you have left this transition period of readapting or restructuring your language, as I've done many times in my life. As for processing mechanisms, I think this is maybe where it's slightly more interesting in a way, because I just looked at the gender marking literature. It's a young literature. We started part of it off in Neuchâtel when we looked at, and this is just for the petite histoire, as we say in French. I was interested in the fact that when my oldest son would come back home and would tell me, they keep correcting my gender use. They say it's not la garçon, it's le garçon. What's wrong with these people? And I tried to appease him, help him through his becoming bilingual, but ask myself the question, what's going on? Is it really the purism of the French and French speakers? There's some of that. But it could be that, in fact, we use gender marking in our processing of speech and language. And so we started off looking at that. And then with Deng-Phing Guillemot, we did a study with bilinguals, and which we published. And what's interesting in that study is that we had two types of bilinguals. We had early bilinguals who acquired English and French before the age of 5, and we had late bilinguals. These are people who were brought up in an English-speaking country, came to Neuchâtel at the age of 20, and had been there about 20 years. They spoke fluent French. They made very few gender errors in their production, okay? And we tested them using a word naming task, I believe. And what we found is that they simply could not use gender in their recognition of French nouns. It was just amazing. Neither in the congruent situation or in the incongruent. It's as if they were deaf to gender marking, okay? Even though they understood everything, their comprehension is perfect, they just could not use it. And for me, that's definitely one of the interesting aspects of bilingualism research is what are the things that you might not get, okay? Maybe the contrast falls into that, the contrasts fall into that, but which you can make compensate in other ways, rich context, etc. So that's definitely an area that I think is exciting. Of course, that those gender studies continued, and now it seems as if maybe if the context is rich enough, and if second language or late learners of a language become highly proficient, maybe they can start using gender marking. But there's more to be done in that area. Now, I'm still in the first part, spoken word recognition, and I'm coming now, arriving at the last section of that, and that is language activation in bilinguals. As all of you know, and I recognize many colleagues in the front row, for the last 10, 15, 20 years, the message has been there's non-selectivity, okay? That is that both or 3 or 4 languages, my God, are active in processing the signal that is coming in. And some of our colleagues pretty adamant, okay? And even recently, in 2013, David Green and Abu Talebi state that there's substantial evidence that indicates that bilingual listeners, in bilingual listeners, both languages are active, even when only one is being used. And Weber and Proesma in 2012 have written that a set of candidates is multiplied with parallel activation of words from the mother tongue and from the second language. And of course, we all know that early work on this, and I'm thinking here of the seminal study by Spivey and Marion in 1999, did seem to show the activation of both languages, okay? But over the years, a more balanced picture is coming through, and it makes more sense, as many of these conclusions do, okay? I'm always worried by strong statements one way or strong statements the other, because it's always more complex than that. And in fact, we now know that, again, in speech, I've only looked at the speech literature, that there are a number of factors which will lead to total activation of the other language, all the way to total deactivation of the other language. And what are these factors? Of course, language proficiency. Weber and Cutler in 2004 showed that. The type of bottom-up information, is there a lot of information telling you that the other language is present? The presence or not of interlingual homophones, we've been knowing that for a long time, or some time. Linguistic context, and the way the experiment is run. And I won't go into that because I've spent too much time on that 20 years ago, but that's definitely the case. So, in the end, the message is more balanced, okay? Processing will be selective at times and non-selective at other times, and that just makes so much sense. What I thought I'd do now is move on to the second part, okay? There are 4 parts of my talk, processing bilingual speech. And I can start with a little anecdote. When Aneta Pavlenko, I told Aneta Pavlenko, with whom I share the blog, that I was celebrating my 50 years in bilingualism research. I started back in 67, 68 in Paris. If we have time at the end, I'll tell you about May 68, where I was very, very involved. She asked me, if you were to begin your research from scratch in the year 2017, what do you think you would study? And I mentioned 2 areas. And one of the area is to get a better understanding, neurolinguistic and psycholinguistic, of code switching and borrowing, what's known as language mixing. They haven't been studied experimentally very well, and I think new studies will reveal many fascinating things. So for any young researcher, or not so young, in Westcram, think about that, okay? The psycholinguistics of mixed language processing is only just starting, I'm afraid. In our new book of Krista, I dedicate a whole chapter on that, so let me tell you what I studied in that chapter. The first one is, the first question I ask myself is, does the processing of the perception of code, spoken code switches take extra processing time? Okay? And I went back 40 years, back to Montreal, 1971, and that's another little word I'd like to say to young people. Don't hesitate to go back beyond, back to the 20th century. There's some very good studies there, and they'll make your work even more valuable. Well, McNamara and Krishner did one of the first studies looking at whether code switching takes time to process, to perceive and comprehend. And they found that one switch would cost you 260 milliseconds, and 2 switches 410 milliseconds. Their explanation is very interesting. They propose that we have certain expectations as listeners of mixed speech, okay? And that one of them is that the words in the sentence are probably those in the main language being spoken. Remember, code switching isn't 50-50, okay? It's rare. It's usually 80%, something like that, 20% or 90, 10, etc. And the stronger language is being given preference, as it were, in the processing system. And this I've called the base language effect in my writings. Now, some people have talked about a switching cost, okay? And again, I sort of hesitate as bilingual and researcher. My God, you really need to use such a strong term as switching cost. It's like bilingual advantage, okay? It means that monolingual is a disadvantage. I try and keep away from these expressions. But anyway, I think the expression switching cost should be used with moderation, if at all, because bilingual listeners have no problem keeping up with their bilingual speakers, okay? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the delay was replicated by other researchers, and in fact, with my colleague Carlos Herreras, we said, we're going to do things right. This was back in the 80s, okay? We're going to use fluent bilinguals. We're going to put them in a bilingual language mode. We're going to tell them everything we're doing, etc. Do we still get a delay? And we still got a delay, okay? Which is very interesting. It seems to be a powerful thing. And lately, Fitzpatrick and Indefray found N400 evidence for language switching. And Olson, 2016, has also found a slight delay. Spanning 45 years, okay, I put all those spoken language studies together, looking at code switching and delay, and averaged the delay when it was found. One or two didn't find a delay, and it amounts to about 133 milliseconds. We're miles away from switching cost, okay? Now, what are the factors that modulate the delay? And that's where I think modern research could go dig more, okay? One of them is, it makes sense, it's code switching density. If there are a lot of code switches prior to the actual code switch that you're studying, then the delay will diminish or become zero, okay? That makes a lot of sense. The guest language is more and more activated, and therefore costs you less, as it were, in your processing. The other, another factor is language mode, okay? If you do your work, and this I'm thinking of the Cheng and Howard study, if you do your study in the right context, taking care of all the factors that I've mentioned, then you can actually reduce the delay to zero. There is no delay. This is a study in 2008 by Cheng and Howard. And interesting question, because the data is not quite clear, where the switch takes place in the sentence. Is it within a constituent? Is it between sentences? Is it between phrases, between clauses, between sentences? There's definitely something to dig there, because it might have an effect. There's evidence for, evidence against, so I won't give a definite answer on that, but it's interesting. With two of my students here in Neuchâtel, I wish you'd have an image, picture, so that you could see where we are. We asked ourselves, how long will the delay last? Okay, and so with these two students working on French and Italian here in Switzerland, we looked at the length of the delay. I covered this in my book with Krista. And what we found out is that by the time you get to the next word, the delay is made up. Okay, because remember, words are pretty redundant, and so any processing delay is made up, at least in this study that we did. I describe it in the book. Makes a lot of sense. I mean, I come from a family where we could switch constantly, okay? If you were to record our speech at home, purists would be horrified by the amount of going back and forth between English and French. And of course, now the German is pretty prevalent in the family too. My sons live in Zurich. German comes in too. We don't tell them, hey, stop, wait, I'm trying to process what you just said, okay? So there's something to dig there on this question of delay. And there is one study that I liked by Bunktena, Dijkstra, and Van Hel in 2015, and they seem to show that if you switch into the participant's first language, there's no delay. Otherwise, the delay disappears after a few words, but if you switch into the second language, the delay lasts longer, which is interesting. Okay, so that's that. The other topic I looked at in the second part was processing mixed language, was the recognition of guessed words. I won't spend too much time on that. It's something that I've really worked hard on over the years, but just remind you of a few things. I did a first study on gating study on the question, and in that gating study, borrowings and code switches, I showed that language phonetics, how you pronounce those words, whether in the base language or in the guest language, had an effect. The phonotactics of the words has an effect. Other cues tell you which lexicon they belong to. Homophonic proximity has an effect, and as well as the frequency of the two homophones. Okay, whether it's pushing towards one language or the other. The sound specificity, are some certain sounds specific to the language, giving you a cue as to where that word is, and helping you process it. And of course, the base language effect. It seems as if we are constantly governed by this effect. And then later studies took up some of these variables, added more. Peng Li, my colleague, who's really gone into neurolinguistics now, looked at a lot of these questions, at the phonetics, phonotactics. We're using Chinese and English. My Dutch colleagues, Schumpen, Dijkstra, Schriefers, and Hasper looked at this, homophonic proximity, the impact of that. Some of my students looked at context. Peng Li looked at context too. And something very interesting and new, okay, this is a 2016 paper. Fricke, Kroll, and Ducias examined anticipatory phonetic cues, and that's going to be very exciting, okay? Is the speaker, without realizing, of course, giving you cues about the code switch that he or she has already planned and is about to utter? And I find that very exciting, and I really hope that kind of research follows through and tells us more about this processing of mixed language. The last section of the second part, processing mixed language, is something that might surprise you because it hasn't been pursued that much, and that is interferences. Okay, now I define interferences as deviations from the language being spoken due to the influence of the other language. And interferences, as I've often said, are very visible, if they exist, okay, when bilinguals are in a strictly monolingual mode, as I'm trying to be currently, okay? I'm really not trying to let my French come in, my Italian, my sign languages, and is in my arm waving, although that might be my French culture. But I'm really trying to be in a monolingual mode, and I think it's Margaret Duchamp many years ago. After a lecture, and said, I noticed a few interferences from French. And I said, yeah, those exist. And I'm all for doing a psycholinguistics of interferences. But what's interesting, if you want, is that there are umpteen books and articles on interferences in production, far fewer on perception. Okay, and the question with some of our colleagues here that we asked is, are bilinguals helped by interferences? Or let's say, do they suffer as much as monolinguals? And this is where the monolinguals come in, when they perceive interferences. And so we found one study outside, Blair and Harris 81 study, and we did two studies ourselves. These are phoneme monitoring studies, and Blair and Harris used English sentences containing Spanish interferences. We used French and German, French texts with German interferences in both cases, in the two studies done here. Here in Neuchâtel, we looked at global comprehension, but we also looked at word monitoring, specific difficulties at various points. And what comes out of that is very interesting. That is that bilinguals seem to process interferences better in continuous speech than do monolinguals. And this is the case especially with words that have no transparent counterparts, okay? I mean, basically these words are borrowed. They weren't supposed to be borrowed, but they're borrowed from the other language, are given French morphology, etc. And monolinguals have real problems with them. I mean, what's this word, okay? Those are very interesting, as it happens. And also idiomatic expressions. I mean, all the bilinguals try quadrilinguals in Veszprém and all over the world, know how hard it is to give the appropriate idiomatic expression in the other language. It's so difficult, okay? And it's a trap. And of course, monolinguals really suffer with basically literally translated idiomatic expressions, but bilinguals come out scot-free. Oh yeah, that's what I understood, etc. They can then revert back to what it was supposed to be. And basically, bilinguals can use their other language to help process these interferences. So I've come to halfway through the talk. I'm really sorry that I can't show you the cognitive parts of this talk. It really helps. I'm really keen on showing my students where we stand and audience. But unfortunately, I can't. So again, I'll try and do my best. The third, if you remember, topic that I was going to talk about is the complementarity principle. And just a brief reminder, and then two things that might be of interest to researchers. Okay, the brief reminder has been around now. It's and that's simply that maybe as psycholinguists we haven't paid enough attention to the sociolinguistics of bilingualism. And some of you might say, but why, Grosjean, do you pay attention to that? Well, maybe there are two reasons. I didn't come to psycholinguistics until I'd finished a degree in linguistics, okay, where we dealt with different types of linguistics. And then it's only then that I entered experimental psycholinguistics. And so I'm a fan, a big fan of all the branches of linguistics, helping us in our work as psycholinguists of bilingualism. And the other thing is that, I wrote a book back in '82, and I wanted it to be as broad as possible, okay? And so there are at least two chapters, one bilingualism in the United States and another one, the bilingual in society, where I really had to read the literature in sociolinguistics of bilingualism, and that really helped me a lot. And with all of that, I started realizing that we really do need to not only ask ourselves, how fluent is this person? How often does he or she use each language? But we also have to ask ourselves, where is that language used? For what domain? What to do? Okay, these kinds of, does this person know the vocabulary or know the language of a particular area or domain? Okay, and you've seen my complementarity principle diagram, and which basically explains the way I explain the CP, let me call it the CP. Bilinguals usually acquire and use their languages for different purposes in different domains of life with different people. Different aspects of life require different languages. Therefore, based on that, okay, we can start asking ourselves, is there any psycholinguistic evidence for the complementarity principle? When you bring something into a field, then you've got to sort of show that it's present, okay? And so in the chapter that's in one of the chapters in the book, no, this is a chapter, sorry, in the Treffers-Dahler and Silva-Corvallen and Treffers-Dahler book on dominance. I have a whole chapter on the complementarity principle, and if anybody asks me about it, I just send them this chapter. Please do so if you want it. In it, I describe 4 studies that show evidence, 2 that were done in Neuchâtel, and 2 were done outside by other researchers. One of the studies at the Châtel, I thought I'd describe it. I was going to show you things, but I can't, but it doesn't matter. Christine Gasser from Basel, because I had a lectureship in Basel and many Basel students came to study with me in the Châtel. I told her, this is a fascinating topic, and as it happens, people who don't have much psycholinguistics or more linguistics say, oh yeah, let me go look at that, okay? So she went off and looked at how English-German bilinguals in Basel, again, these were 40, 50-year-olds who arrived in Basel around age 20, who, of course, knew maybe some German, but definitely acquired German and Swiss German to some extent since they arrived. They'd been bilingual for 22 years, so these were well-established static bilinguals, as it were, more or less. And she went off and looked at how frequently they talked about topics and did various activities, both in German and in English, okay? And she worked out the distribution. We did it together. It was a lot of work because this was new work. Looked at the distribution of languages and found, of course, that, in fact the topics and the activities are distributed across languages, okay? Most are talked about in only one language. Maybe a bit the other language, but most in one language. So, for example, family, immediate and distant, home and love was spoken in English, where you use English, and of course, and other things like leisure, shopping, administration in German alone. And with her, we developed a complementarity index, principle index, which I talk about in the chapter. A year later, 2 other students, this time Italian and French students, did the same kind of work in a different part of Switzerland, same approach, and found more or less the same thing. That is, that the languages are spread across domains and activities, okay? And there aren't that many that share a domain, for example, where 2 or 3 languages are used, okay? Exterior evidence is starting to come through. Carol and Luna in 2011 showed the CP present. Chiaro showed it present too in 2009. And then basically what's coming through, but we need much more work, is that languages are indeed distributed differently across domains. And again, just stepping back, and as regular multilinguals together today, that's the case. Okay, the example I give all the time is when I arrived back in Europe and in Switzerland 30 years ago, and offered to teach a course in statistics. I knew statistics. I've actually published a book, an intro book on statistics. I had such difficulty teaching that course the first semester. I was constantly saying, how do you say that in French? It was a disaster. My statistics domain was an English domain, and I had to make it into a French domain. Now, life isn't quite as tough as that, okay? But you get the feel. And so I looked at the impact, I started looking at the impact, and one needs to continue to do that, of the CP on the psycholinguistics of bilingualism. And I'm starting to find work both in language perception. Carol and Luna used lexical decision tasks, showed that words in the language used in the word's content areas, for example, work for English, friends and family in Spanish, are more accessible in that language, okay? In language production, we found with my students that there's more language mixing when you are speaking in the wrong language to bilinguals, okay? Because you got to go somewhere, something you can't do with monolinguals. I mentioned also in this chapter in the Corvallen and Trefesdale book, memory studies. And I keep mentioning it because I'm often asked about this. Yeah, but what about kids? What about kids? And I was so happy to see a Bialystok, Muke, Pietz, and Yang 2010 study that actually showed the reality of the complementarity principle. Okay, when the kids were tested for vocabulary in home language, okay, they suffered more in English than did their monolingual counterparts. But when they were tested in school language, school vocabulary, they showed exactly the same results. And I said, hey, this is the CP in real life, okay? And I think it's really something that we have to take into account. As for language dominance, in the chapter I talk about it. We know that bilinguals are globally dominant in a language, but unfortunately, the CP is not yet taken into account. And when I wrote that chapter for the Corvalin and Sylvain Corvalin and Travis Dare book, I sent in the chapter quite early, and very nicely the other authors from the other chapters said, paid attention to what I was saying. And Carmen Sylvain Corvalin and Janine Travis Dare, actually, this is a big book, it's just come out a year ago, actually put the CP in their definition, and that's kind of nice to know that it's going to play a role in our future work. And they actually write, we define dominant language as that in which a bilingual has attained an overall higher level of proficiency at a given age, and or the language which he uses more frequently. Those are the two pillars that are often mentioned, use and proficiency, when talking about bilinguals. But then they add, and across a wider domain, a range of domains, which is interesting. I'm of the mind that, in fact, one's got to push it even further, and that for certain domains I'm English dominant, for other domains I'm French dominant, and for a third set of domains I can do both. Are you still following me cognitively? Fourth part, okay? The fourth part is bicultural bilinguals, okay? If I skip into bilingualism instead of biculturalism, please correct me. It should be bicultural most of the time in what I'm going to say. I'm really sorry, as an academic, I mean, I don't suffer too much from it, but I'm sorry that biculturalism has not been a variable in psycholinguistic studies of bilingualism. At the very least as a control variable, but also as an independent variable. And I'd really like to encourage researchers to team up with social psychologists and cultural psychologists and do psycholinguistic work looking at this other aspect. Let me first start with a few traits, the way I characterize biculturals. These three traits, I thought about them and proposed them to the literature a long time ago, in 87, 88. And I was very pleased to see that cultural psychologists and social psychologists, such as Nguyen and Bennett Martinez in 2007, took up the same three traits, okay, which shows that other people, it's not that just Grosjean talking about this, it's other researchers. And the three traits are that, one, you take part in two or more cultures, okay? The second trait is that you adapt, in part at least, to your attitude, your behaviors, your values, and your languages to these cultures, if need be. And the third trait is that you combine and you blend aspects of the cultures involved. Certain characteristics, attitudes, beliefs, values, etc., come from one or the other culture, whereas other characteristics are blends based on these cultures. I've always been fascinated by this blend aspect because I feel personally that I'm a blend of four cultures. In fact, French from my early years in France, English from my 10 years in English public schools and boarding schools, American from my 12 years in the United States, and now Swiss with 30 years. And some of my behaviors I can adapt. Others I simply cannot, okay? Adapting is fascinating, okay? I'm always doing things wrong, which shows that adaptation is difficult. how much do you tip in Paris? Quick. How much do you tip in the Netherlands? How much do you tip in... I keep asking people. I don't want to make the mistake. Okay, I remember being a student and not tipping somebody and got blown up. Okay, and because I'd just come back from France. So some of the things you can adapt, some you cannot. There are definitely parts of us as multiculturals that are blends, and that really needs to be looked at if you want. Other points that are important is we can be culturally dominant. Okay, that's for sure. It doesn't have to be... I think we can learn a lot about the work we've done on bilingualism when we look at biculturalism. Bilingualism and biculturalism are not coextensive. You can be bilingual without being bicultural. And I'd like to propose to all my Dutch colleagues who have students, let's say, in the Netherlands who listen and speak beautiful English, despite what Anne Kotler and Weber and others say, okay, I would propose that, in fact, many of those bilinguals are not bicultural, okay, unless they've spent extended stays in England, Ireland, Scotland, America, etc. They're basically bilingual. And I would like to propose that in Switzerland, in the German part of Switzerland, in these diglottic countries, Swiss German and the German Swiss are bilingual in Swiss German and German, but are not bicultural. Okay, they haven't lived in Germany, they haven't lived in Austria, so one can be one without being the other. And of course, the other way around, you can be bicultural without being bilingual. Think of all those British people who've lived in the States for 10, 15 years. I mean, they're definitely bicultural, but they're still, plus or minus a few dialectal differences. They're basically monolingual. You can become bilingual and bicultural at the same time or at different times. That's true. You can wax and wane your biculturalism. Okay. Again, I'm an example of somebody who's switched between my various cultures, made some more important for a while, then less important. Okay. And of course, dominance will change. And again, for those who might be interested, but use a colleague who knows about this, one should look at whether the language mode concept can work for biculturals, okay? That is that sometimes you are in a monocultural mode, okay? I know that I try to be in a monocultural mode in some situations. I can't smile as much, maybe. I can't joke. I can't... and then, of course, you can be with other biculturals, sharing your same cultures, and you can be in a bicultural mode, and then you can use both aspects of those cultures. So that's very exciting. Now, why do we need to take into account biculturalism? Why? Okay, in the psycholinguistics of bilingualism. Well, the first thing is, at least as a control variable, I hardly see this as mentioned as a control variable. And as I said in that interview, this is the other thing that I mentioned to Anita Pavlenko when she asked me, how would you, if you were to start all over again, what would you work on? And I told her studies have rarely divided up the bilingual participants into those who are monocultural. Remember that many bilinguals are members of just one culture, I told her, and those who are bicultural. And yet, interacting frequently with two or more cultures will no doubt have a profound impact on how languages are stored and are processed. If I had a lot of money and all the power in the world, I'd take those lovely, I'm saying this with a smile, Dutch bilinguals that have been tested over 30 years, okay, and I'd move them to America for 12 years or to England for 12 years, okay? And then I'd retest them. And I'm sure you would find differences in many of the results that you found. Okay, and the other thing is that I think we need to take into account biculturalism because it probably has an impact on certain things that we're interested in. For example, the bilingual lexicon, okay? Bicultural bilinguals probably have representations or concepts that are different from their monocultural bilinguals. Now, they're all tested together, but in fact, I'm sure that this is the case, and we know that's the case. When I think bread and when I think pain, I do not think of the same thing, okay? Bread is this stuff that you, what is it? It's baked in a large loaf. Bread pan is the baguette, okay? I mean, I have different presentation. When I ask for a coffee and when I ask for a café, I didn't have the same representation. I'm told that now you can buy a café everywhere, okay? But just not the same thing. You know, the soup drink versus the hard Nespresso type drink, okay? And this is true of many things. Of course, Joran Weinreich, back in '53, talked about this a bit, okay? It's interesting. His famous coordinate versus compound bilinguals, okay? But we need to dig further into that, okay? Because things are not as clear-cut, and Aneta Pavlenko and Annette de Groot and others have talked about these representations where the words in the two languages can have different cultural underpinnings or can have shared components or totally overlapping message and meanings, etc. I think we should not only just try and describe that, but go off and test subjects on that by making sure that they correspond to the groups that we're interested in, bicultural on one hand, bilingual on the other. And of course, biculturalism will have an impact on the higher levels of processing, and those we need to work on more. We need to take into account knowledge of the world in our research. And we're talking about two or more worlds for bicultural people, or multicultural people, and only one for monocultural. We need to bring in rules of communication in our research. And that's where, of course, we need to link up with social psychologists and cross-cultural psychologists and just move on into, I think, what will probably be a fascinating topic. If in 10, 15, 20 years' time you see this as a new area, the younger people of bilingualism, think of Grosjean in 2018 telling you, go for it, go for it. Okay, so I'll stop my talk here, and I propose that we give ourselves 10 minutes. Okay, so it's a few minutes before 12. We meet back at 10 past. Is that okay? And then I'll start with the written questions I received, and then we can open it up for a discussion. Okay? See you soon. À bientôt.
Thank you very much. Okay. See.
So now I'm going to spend about 20 minutes trying to answer the questions that you very kindly sent me via Judith. Two things maybe. One, I thought that I'd organize my talk around those questions, but when I saw how diversified they were, I decided that it's better that I do something a bit easier, which I did in the first part. And the second thing I'd like to say before starting is that I don't have good answers to many of them, I'm afraid. There's so much one can know about bilingualism, but if the areas are not well studied, not well defined, then it's my best guess. And so I'm sorry not to be able to give definite answers to many of these questions. I also asked some of my colleagues when I felt that a colleague would be better at answering. I wrote to the person and said, what do you think? Okay, so I'll mention a few colleagues as we go along. I took these questions and I put them into various categories. And the first category are general aspects of bilingualism. And the very first question is there a difference between speaking two languages and speaking two dialects? And my answer is this. I'm sure that yours would be the same. Well, it really depends how similar or different the languages are and how similar and different the dialects are to one another, right? Some dialects are in fact languages. As we know, they don't have a navy and an army, but in fact they're languages. And what applies to bilingualism between two languages would also apply to bidialectalism. In other cases, this is not the case, and so all I can hope is that research on bilingualism between a language and a dialect picks up, and then between two dialects, and that we learn about this in the future. Then there was a specific question. What do you call a speaker of two dialects? Well, I looked around, and I'm afraid I don't know, because bidialectal is an adjective. I searched hard, so maybe it's time for us to make into a noun, at least in English, and talk about bidialectals as we talk about bilinguals. But I know of no word yet, at least as far as official dictionaries go. Here is an easier question for me. If an individual knows a verbal language and a non-verbal language, like sign language or whistling, is he or she bilingual? Now, I've actually written a lot about the deaf and bilingualism between written language, some speech, and sign bilingualism. So just look at my website, there are a whole series of papers, and my sort of slide or save, because I don't work with that people anymore, is a 2010 paper that came out, I think, in the International, I'm not quite sure, but look it up on my website, and I talk about that. So yes, these people are bilingual, and in fact, if you go to a place like Gallaudet College or University in Washington, D.C., their important theme when you enter is bilingualism. Okay, I mean, it's a fine way, if you want, of englobing people who want only to sign but use a bit of the majority language, to those who are implanted with hearing implants and who prefer to speak. So basically, the mot d'ordre, as we say, is bilingualism. Now, another question, does the bilingual advantage apply to sign language, oral language bilinguals, as it applies to ordinary bilinguals? So I wrote to my friend Karen Emery, who's at the University of San Diego, and asked her, what about it? Is there a bilingual advantage in these kinds of bilinguals? And in fact, she wrote a paper in 2008 on the topic. So look up her paper with others, I think. And she told me that she did not find a bilingual advantage, okay, for these bimodal bilinguals. And what I added to my response here to you is, but then so many studies these last years have not replicated the effect first found by Ellen Bialystok, so be careful, be careful. As you know, I have a sort of neutral position on this, although I, like others, have talked about the bilingual advantage, but now I think we need to step back a bit, let all these researchers get together, work, control many things, etc., and then maybe in 4, 5, 6 years' time we'll really know where we stand. But it's a very hot potato currently. But in any case, Karen Emery did not find in her study of 2008 a bilingual advantage for these bimodal bilinguals, as we call them. Okay, let me go to the next section, which is describing the bilingual. The question was, is there a certain number of languages on average a person can learn without overburdening the mind? And my answer is not that I know of, okay? Now, certainly there are very few people who know, even less use, 20, 30, 40 languages, okay? Those famous polyglots. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't believe so. I think the mind can be multilingual, okay? But again, it's I don't have the answer. So I don't think there's you're going to overburden the mind. Another question, are bilinguals who speak two completely different languages different from bilinguals who speak two similar languages? My feeling, again, we need more work here, is that those two bilinguals will be similar on many foundational aspects of bilingualism. Language mode, complementarity principle, how they live their lives with two or more languages, but they'll probably differ in the actual configuration of their linguistic knowledge, phonology, lexicon, grammar. But again, that really needs to be researched more. And by the way, on any of the topics I dealt with in my talk, or on any of these, if some of you have a paper that really addresses the issue, please send it via email. And I'm a good reader, and I also always answer my emails, so definitely thank you. On the complementarity principle, there was just one question. How do you deal with bilingualism and dementia? And my response is that this is a very interesting question. I don't have a response. But then if we take the complementarity principle as a foundational aspect or concept in bilingualism, one should again encourage longitudinal studies that would cover bilinguals before the onset of dementia and after, okay? And see if the domains of use of these languages are affected, and if, in fact, the CP is an explanatory factor in the situation currently. It'd be very nice. There were a few questions on the organization of the mental lexicon. The question is it true that lexical items are stored in groups based on the semantic meaning all across the brain? Does it mean that a word like book in English would be stored in a location with its Arabic equivalent in the same place exactly? Or is it like parallel systems that coexist each on its own? I'm not really a representation person. I'm more into data, but I would say the following thing. I would imagine that words of the same meaning are stored together, whether they're synonyms or words from different languages. I mean, think about that. This said, I still believe in what Michel Paradis, the neurolinguist, stated many years ago. Bilinguals have two subsets of neural connections, one for each language. Each can be activated or inhibited independently because of the strong associations between elements, while at the same time they possess one larger set from which they're able to draw elements of either language at any time. As you know, I'm very much a connectionist in my thinking. Qu'est-ce de bot? I salute you. What happened to the bilingual lexicon? Question mark. I expected a smiley after that, your question mark. Once a leading theme, now hardly anything new. My view from my mountains in Switzerland is that it's still there, but research has shown that things are more complicated than thought at first. And so researchers are probably regrouping, maybe doing other work, but I'm sure that the younger researchers will take up the relay and tell us more soon. So the Bilingual Lexicon book, in 10, 15, 20 years, there'll be another one called the Bilingual Lexicon 2, maybe, and we'll know more about the lexicon. And then Judith asked me, after the brain mapping video, how do you see the storage hypothesis, or is it still relevant at all? And I think we've got to rethink things. It's the impact of brain research is hitting us hard. We've got to keep our minds open. We've got to regroup, do more work, and maybe we'll have an answer at some point. Now we are entering troubled waters, the bilingual mind and brain. Kes asks me, do languages exist as separate entities in our brain or in society? Now, I won't answer on the society aspect. It's a tough issue, and he and I have already talked about that via email. But on the brain, I said, well, why don't I go and see what Ping Li says? Okay, I mean, he's a neurolinguist that I respect highly. He doesn't push things too much. And in our psycholinguistics of bilingualism, here is what he says. Okay, so I know it's not Grosjean's answer, but it's a good answer. There is no simple answer as to whether common or distinct neuron systems underlie the representation or processing of the bilingual's two languages. A host of variables, including age of onset, proficiency, task demands, levels of analysis, cross-language overlap, among others, may modulate the functional activities in the bilingual brain. It would indeed be surprising if the bilingual brain did not use both common and distinct neural systems to support the comprehension and production of multiple languages. And then Kes de Bot again asks, to what extent has neurolinguistic evidence contributed to our understanding of the bilingual mind, the multilingual mind? That's the $1 million question, isn't it? And so I said, oh, I'm going to ask Ping. So I wrote to Ping, okay? And this is his answer. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. He wrote, neuroimaging tools, including ERP and fMRI, have helped significantly in understanding how the mind functions. Note he says mind, not the brain. How the mind functions in both temporal processing in time and locational processing in space within the brain structure. I must admit, when I look at all this neurolinguistic work, I sort of regret that I didn't get that kind of training so as to be really able to understand the approaches, the filtering, the data massaging and all that, because you have to do some of that. But how far are they pushing it, etc.? I don't know. It's a regret. I mean, that's. But then there are young people, young researchers who have that kind of background. Krista Myers-Einlein has, I think, a double degree, one in linguistics and one in, I think, in brain imaging or neurolinguistics or neurology. I'm not quite sure. Those are very fascinating people because they'll give us maybe an answer or part of an answer later on. Another difficult domain, mental processes. There are two questions. What language does the bilingual, multilingual think in? And the person who asked that question, instead of repeating what we've said, Aneta Pavlenko and I, on our psychology blog, if you go to the blog, in fact, if you go to my website, you'll see blog, and there you'll see a link to, well, you'll see the menu of the blog. Unfortunately, Psychology Today does not give you a menu. It's just the latest that comes up, okay? And in the menu, you'll see mind and brain, bilingual mind and brain. And there are two posts that I advise you to read. It might give you some answer to your question. Thinking and Dreaming in Two or More Languages. I wrote that one. And What Does It Mean to Think in a Second Language by Aneta Pavlenko. Hopefully something in there will give you some response to your question. Kees de Bort asked a tough question. Inner speech is seen as important for language development, in particular in a Wittgensteinian perspective. But when we talk to ourselves, who is listening? Kees, were you a philosophy major at some point? There I said, I've got to ask Aneta Pavlenko this, okay, because she's a thinking type, I mean, talks about this in her speech, etc. And she very kindly sent me this little paragraph, and it's not bad. She says, she defines inner speech as subvocal or silent self-talk. That is mental activity that takes place in an identifiable linguistic code. Because inner speech is a dialogic activity, we are both speakers and listeners at the same time, according to her. Speaking to ourselves allows us to plan, rehearse, play with language, be creative, and basically try out things that we'll later try out on others. That's her answer. Hopefully the present case finds something in there. Second, language learning. One question. Why are some people good at learning languages and some are not? Okay. I'm not an expert on second language learning, but I would encourage you to read a short post that Aneta Pavlenko wrote for our blog called The Secrets of a Successful Language Learner. And she interviews somebody, but that person delves into it, and it's kind of interesting. So hopefully you'll find something there. Then there's a whole section on bilingualism, intelligence, and creativity. First question, does bilingualism, multilingualism enhance intelligence? If so, what kind of intelligence? Emotional, social, spatial, musical, etc. Look, I'll give you my personal feeling, okay? I've personally never felt that bi and multilinguals are more or less intelligent than monolinguals. I'm always defending monolinguals in my writings and talks, etc. And I just note, if you want, that the cognitive advantage literature is in real turmoil currently, and that seems to go my way. I'd be very surprised that the good Lord somewhere up high would say, okay, I'm going to make monolinguals and I'm going to make the rest of the world bi or multilingual, okay? and I'm going to give intelligence to one and not to the others. Come on. We, throughout history, people we would esteem as extremely intelligent in all of these domains, emotional, spatial, musical. Some are monolinguals and some are bilingual, so one's got to be extremely careful, I think. And maybe on a particular task, maybe if it comes through and it's proven, etc., over and over again, we'll find something. But I would just say, hold off, okay? Doesn't mean that for those who are young and thinking about making their children bi or multilingual, you should not do that. There are many, many other psychological, social factors coming in. But on the question of intelligence, I think one's got to be very, very careful. Another question was, is intelligence considered an essential factor when learning a new language in adulthood? And again, my answer is, again, I'm not an expert in this, but my gut feeling is that intelligence is not an essential factor. The psychosocial need for a language, the right amount of input, the personal motivation of the learner, etc., seem to be much more important factors than intelligence. And then there's the question, does bilingualism, multilingualism increase creativity? And my answer is this. I'm not sure that bi or multilinguals are more creative than monolinguals, okay? Being bicultural, on the other hand, may enhance creativity, okay? This is the whole dichotomy, bilingual, bicultural. And in a blog that I worked hard on, a blog post that I worked hard on, I described a study by Tadmore, Gilinski, and Maddox, who showed that biculturals exhibited an increase in 3 components of creativity. 1, fluency, in generating more ideas. 2, flexibility, greater number of ideas. And 3, novelty, suggestions to be more creative. And I think that many more studies like this are needed, but we've got to be very careful if people enter into this field, not to fall into the cognitive advantage trap, okay? Because it's such a shame. The main press, the people's press, take hold of that, and there we are as researchers suffering because of that. And then finally, on bilingual children, there was one question: what consequences can occur in case a child receives several language inputs randomly from different sources, that is, not following a specific approach in exposing the child to languages? And my answer is this: the crucial factors that are needed to become bilingual, I described them in fact in my Bilingual Life in Reality 2010, are the need for a language. This is so important. The right amount and type of input, support from the family, crucial, and the school, and a positive attitude to the languages in question. On that front, by the way, things are not changing very quickly in the French part of Switzerland. Families are not very supportive of learning German, which kids have to do from the age of 10 or 9 in the French part, okay? There's this kind of attitude that German is not a nice sounding language and all that, and it's definitely not helping these kids learn the language. A positive attitude is so crucial. The problem with an interchangeable strategy at home, depending on the topic, person, situation, etc., is probably that the majority language may become dominant as the child spends more and more time at school and outside the home with friends. And that's where the minority language will need some help. And basically, I think, although we didn't ask people this, when people thought up of these various parent strategies, helping the minority language is a crucial factor. Okay, it really needs help, and using the home outside the home or one person, one language approach gives it more help than having a free-flowing type of exchange with the kids. But talking about kids, I'm the happy grandfather of a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and the 5-year-old switches in front of me between Swiss German and French, and I'm amazed. And I say, I don't know German, horse was German. He says, "Don't fais pas, don't worry, Grandpa, I'll translate for you." And I'm amazed. So maybe I'll end this particular part by, we should write a book, The Amazement of Bi and Multilingualism, okay? And then go and look at these young kids. He's 5 years old. He speaks Swiss German with his friends, French with his grandparents and parents, English with a person who comes to take care of him. That's the miracle of bilingualism.